You will not believe what happens to the girl at the end. Make sure to like and subscribe so we can continue writing stories like this one. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.
Hank was a rancher through and through. He knew the land like the back of his hand, every gully, every rock, every stubborn patch of sagebrush. He'd built his ranch, the Lazy H, from almost nothing, working sunup to sundown. Folks respected Hank. He was a man of his word, fair in his dealings, and always ready to lend a hand to a neighbor in need. Sheriff Brody was just as respected, but in a different way. He wore his badge with pride, a symbol of his commitment to keeping the peace in Dust Bowl Gulch. He wasn't a fast gun or a hothead, but he was steady, calm, and possessed a quiet authority that commanded attention. He'd always been fair, treating everyone the same, rich or poor, newcomer or old-timer. For years, Hank and Brody had been friends. They'd shared stories over campfires, helped each other out during tough times, and generally looked out for one another. But that was before the drought. Before the land turned to dust, before the water dried up, and before desperation set in. The trouble started subtly. A few stray cows wandering onto the town's grazing land. A terse word exchanged at the general store. A lingering look that spoke volumes of suspicion and distrust. The dry riverbed, which had always been a natural boundary between Hank's ranch and the town's common land, became a symbol of their growing animosity. It was a dividing line, not just of land, but of principles, of survival, and of who deserved what little remained. The respect they once shared was now buried under layers of dust and resentment, threatening to erupt into something far more dangerous. The sun beat down on Dust Bowl Gulch like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil. The sky, usually a bright, cheerful blue, was now a hazy, pale imitation, choked with dust that swirled in the air like a restless spirit. The wind, when it blew, carried not the scent of rain, but the gritty taste of sand and the mournful howl of a land slowly dying. The creek, once a lively ribbon of water that snaked through the valley, was now nothing but a cracked, dry scar on the earth. Willows that had thrived along its banks were brittle and brown, their leaves long gone, scattered by the relentless wind. Fish, long since perished, lay as skeletons in the cracked mud. Animals suffered the most. Hank's cattle, once sleek and healthy, were now gaunt and listless, their ribs showing through their thinning hides. Their moans were weak and pathetic as they searched in vain for patches of green that no longer existed. Even the tough desert creatures, the jackrabbits, the coyotes, the roadrunners, were scarce, driven away by the lack of food and water. The town wasn't faring much better. Gardens withered and died, wells ran dry, and the dust coated everything. Houses, furniture, even the food on the tables. People walked with their heads down, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a weary resignation. The laughter and chatter that once filled the streets were replaced by a heavy silence, broken only by the creak of windmills struggling to draw water from the depths of the earth, or the mournful braying of a hungry donkey. The drought wasn't just drying up the land, it was drying up the spirit of Dust Bowl Gulch. It was a slow, agonizing death, and everyone felt it in their bones. The hope that things would get better was fading with each passing day, replaced by a gnawing fear of what the future held. The dry riverbed had always been a simple fact of life in Dust Bowl Gulch. During the rainy season, it would swell into a rushing torrent, carving its way through the landscape. But for most of the year, it was a wide, sandy expanse, easily crossed on foot or by wagon. It marked the boundary. Hank's ranch on one side, the town's grazing land on the other. Everyone knew the line, and everyone respected it. Until the drought. Now, the riverbed wasn't just dry. It was bone dry. The sand was fine and powdery, shifting with every breeze. But beneath the surface, something had changed. As the wells around Dust Bowl Gulch began to fail, some of the townsfolk started to notice that the sand in the riverbed felt cooler, damp even. It was a faint hope, a whisper of moisture in a sea of dust. But it was enough. The town's cattle, desperate for water, began to drift towards the riverbed, sniffing at the sand, pawing at the ground. Hank, fiercely protective of his remaining water sources, saw this as a direct threat. He knew that even the smallest amount of moisture in the riverbed could be vital to his cattle's survival. He'd invested everything he had in the Lazy H, and he wasn't about to let the town's livestock drink it dry. The townsfolk, equally desperate, saw it differently. They argued that the riverbed was common land, a shared resource. They had as much right to whatever water might be hidden beneath the sand as Hank did. They pointed out that Hank's cattle were already grazing on the edges of the town's land and that he was hoarding what little water he had. The dry riverbed, once a simple boundary, had become a battleground. a symbol of scarcity, of desperation, and of the growing divide between Hank and the town he had always considered his own. It was no longer just about water, it was about survival, about fairness, and about who would control the future of Dust Bowl Gulch. The first fence to go was a section of Hank's, bordering the riverbed. He found it one morning, neatly cut, the posts lying flat in the sand. He knew it was the townsfolk letting their cattle graze closer to the dampness. He repaired it, tighter than before, adding extra wire. The next day it was down again, the wire twisted and broken. This time Hank didn't fix it. He just stood there, staring at the damage, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowed. Then came the arguments. At the general store, at the saloon, even at church, whispers turned into shouts, accusations flew like bullets, and old grievances resurfaced. Hank accused the townsfolk of stealing his water, of letting their cattle trespass, of trying to run him off his land. The townsfolk accused Hank of being greedy, of hoarding water, of letting his cattle overgraze the common land, of forgetting that he was once one of them. Sheriff Brody tried to keep the peace, but it was like trying to hold back a flood with a bucket. He mediated, he reasoned, he pleaded, but no one was listening. The tension was a thick, suffocating blanket over Dust Bowl Gulch, ready to ignite at the slightest spark. The closest they came to a full-blown gunfight was one sweltering afternoon. Hank found a group of townsfolk digging in the riverbed, near what he considered his property line. Words were exchanged, harsh and bitter. Guns were drawn, fingers tightened on triggers. Sheriff Brody arrived just in time, his voice booming across the dry landscape, ordering everyone to stand down. He managed to defuse the situation, but the look in Hank's eyes and the defiant glare of the townsfolk told him that this was only a temporary reprieve. Something had to give, or Dust Bowl Gulch was going to tear itself apart. The air crackled with anger, ready to explode. Sheriff Brody knew something had to be done. He dreaded calling a town meeting. Such meetings usually ended with more anger than solutions, but the situation had become too dangerous to ignore. He hammered the notice onto the door of the general store, "Town meeting, water crisis, be there." The meeting was held in the dusty town hall, its benches worn smooth by generations of disagreements. The air was thick with heat and resentment. Everyone was there. Grizzled ranchers, weary farmers, shopkeepers with worried faces, and women holding crying babies. The atmosphere was heavy with a sense of impending doom. Brody stood at the front, his face grim. He tried to speak calmly, to reason with them, but his words were met with a chorus of complaints and accusations. Hank stood off to one side, his arms crossed, his face set like stone. He didn't say a word, but his presence was a challenge, a silent declaration of war. "He's hoarding all the water," someone shouted, pointing at Hank. "He's letting his cattle drink us dry," another voice chimed in. "He doesn't care about anyone but himself," a woman cried, her voice cracking with emotion. Hank finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "I worked for what I have. I'm not going to let you people take it away from me." The room erupted. Shouts and insults filled the air. Brody banged his gavel, but it was useless. The meeting had devolved into a shouting match, a venting of years of frustration and resentment. No solutions were offered, no compromises were made. Just blame and anger. Brody watched in despair as the town he had sworn to protect seemed determined to destroy itself. The meeting adjourned without any resolution, leaving everyone feeling more hopeless than before. Dust Bowl Gulch was a powder keg, and the fuse was lit. The day after the disastrous town meeting, a buckboard wagon rattled into Dust Bowl Gulch, stirring up a fresh cloud of dust. A young woman, no older than 20, sat on the driver's seat, her eyes wide with curiosity as she took in the parched landscape. This was Maggie, a newcomer to Dust Bowl Gulch, answering a call for a schoolteacher. She'd come from a green valley where water flowed freely and the land was fertile. Dust Bowl Gulch was a shock. She found Sheriff Brody sitting on the porch of the general store, looking defeated. He barely glanced up as she approached. "You must be Miss Maggie," he said, his voice flat. "Welcome to Dust Bowl Gulch, though I can't say I recommend it." Maggie smiled, undeterred. "It's certainly different," she said, trying to sound optimistic. "I heard about the town meeting. Sounds like things are difficult." Brody sighed. "Difficult is an understatement. We're about to tear ourselves apart over water." Maggie paused, thinking. She had an idea, a simple one, but maybe, just maybe, it could work. "What if," she said, "instead of fighting over the little bit of water that's left, You tried to find more. What if you dug a well? Brody looked at her like she was crazy. A well? We've tried wells. Every well in the county is dry. Not just any well, Maggie said, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. A deep well, right in the riverbed. If there's any water left, it'll be deep down. And if you all work together, maybe you could find it. Brody stared at her, considering. It was a crazy idea, but they were out of options. You think Hank would agree to that? Maggie shrugged. It's worth a try. Maybe if he sees everyone working together, he'll realize that they're all in this together. It was a long shot, but Brody was desperate. He looked at Maggie, at her bright eyes and her unwavering optimism, and a flicker of hope sparked within him. Maybe, just maybe, this young schoolteacher had the answer to Dust Bowl Gulch's problems. The answer might be at the bottom of a very deep well. Brody knew convincing Hank wouldn't be easy. He found the rancher mending a fence, his face etched with weariness. Hank, Brody began cautiously, I need to talk to you about something. Hank straightened up, his eyes narrowed. If it's about my cattle, Brody, I'm warning you. It's not, Brody interrupted. It's about the water, and about Maggie's idea. Hank snorted. Maggie? The schoolteacher? What does she know about ranching? Brody explained Maggie's plan about digging a deep well in the riverbed, about everyone working together. Hank listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When Brody finished, Hank spat on the ground. That's the craziest thing I ever heard. Digging a well in that dry creek bed? Waste of time and effort. But what choice do we have, Hank? Brody pleaded. We're running out of options. This town is going to die if we don't find water. Hank hesitated. He looked out at his parched land, at his gaunt cattle, and a flicker of doubt crossed his face. I don't trust those townsfolk, he said finally. They'll steal whatever water we find. Then we'll make sure that doesn't happen, Brody said firmly. We'll set up a system, a fair way to share the water. But we have to try, Hank, for the sake of the town. Took a lot of convincing, but finally Hank grudgingly agreed. He still didn't trust the townsfolk, and he still thought it was a fool's errand, but he was desperate enough to try anything. Convincing the townsfolk was almost as difficult. They were suspicious of Hank, and they didn't trust him to share the water fairly. He'll just take it all for himself, one of them said. He'll poison the well, another one muttered. Brody had to use all his authority to persuade them. He promised to oversee the project, to ensure that everyone got their fair share. He reminded them that they were all in this together, that their survival depended on cooperation. Slowly, reluctantly, they agreed to give it a try. But the air was still thick with distrust, and everyone knew that this fragile alliance could shatter at any moment. The success of the well depended not just on finding water, but on overcoming years of resentment and suspicion. The next morning, a small group gathered at the designated spot in the dry riverbed. Hank stood apart, watching with a critical eye as the townsfolk began to assemble. They brought shovels, picks, and a rusty old hand-crank drill. The air was thick with apprehension. The first few feet were easy, just loose sand. But as they dug deeper, the soil became harder, packed tight by years of drought. Sweat poured down their faces and muscles ached. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the riverbed into a furnace. Hank, despite his initial reluctance, found himself drawn into the work. He was a rancher used to hard labor. He knew how to swing a pick, how to drive a shovel. He couldn't stand by and watch the others struggle. He joined in, his strong arms making quick work of the hardened earth. But even as they worked side by side, the tension remained. Every now and then a sharp word would be exchanged, a reminder of the deep-seated distrust. Hank would glare at the townsfolk, suspecting them of slacking off, of sabotaging the effort. The townsfolk would grumble about Hank's overbearing attitude, about his unwillingness to share his knowledge. Maggie, watching from the sidelines, tried to encourage them, to remind them of their shared goal. She brought them water. She offered words of praise. But it was hard to break through the wall of resentment. Days turned into weeks. The hole grew deeper, but still, there was no sign of water. The hope that had initially spurred them on began to fade. Doubts crept in. Was Maggie's idea just a fool's errand after all? Were they wasting their time and energy on a lost cause? The physical labor was grueling, But the emotional strain was even worse. The shared struggle was slowly chipping away at the wall between them, but it was a slow, painful process. Each swing of the pick, each shovelful of dirt, was a test of their resolve, a challenge to their ability to overcome their differences. The well wasn't just a hole in the ground, it was a measure of their ability to survive, not just the drought, but themselves. The worst happened on a scorching afternoon. The sides of the well, weakened by the constant digging and the dry earth, began to crumble. A section collapsed, burying the tools and threatening to bury anyone who was working at the bottom. A collective gasp went up from the townsfolk. Fear flashed in their eyes. The well, their last hope, was collapsing before their very eyes. Some turned away, defeated. Others started to panic. Hank, without hesitation, sprang into action. He yelled for ropes and timbers. He organized a rescue effort, barking orders with the authority of a man who knew what he was doing. The townsfolk, spurred by his decisive action, responded quickly. They worked together, hauling away the fallen earth, shoring up the sides of the well with timbers. Sheriff Brody, who had been away tending to a dispute on the outskirts of town, arrived just as they were clearing the last of the debris. He surveyed the scene, his face grim. "Is everyone all right?" he asked. "We're fine," Hank said, wiping sweat from his brow. "But the well's in bad shape. We need to reinforce it or it'll collapse again." The task seemed impossible. They were exhausted, discouraged, and their resources were stretched thin. But Hank refused to give up. He rallied the townsfolk, reminding them of how far they had come, of how close they might be to finding water. "We can do this," he said, his voice filled with a newfound determination. "We just have to work together." And they did. They worked through the night, reinforcing the well with every piece of timber they could find. They shared their food, they shared their stories, and for the first time in a long time, they shared a sense of common purpose. The collapse of the well, which had seemed like a disaster, had become a turning point. It had forced them to confront their fears, to overcome their differences, and to rediscover their shared humanity. The setback turned into a moment of unity. With the well reinforced, they resumed digging. The work was even harder now, the earth more compacted, the air thicker with humidity. But the shared experience of the collapse had changed them. They were no longer just digging a well. They were building something more, something stronger than stone and timber. They were building a community. Hank and the townsfolk began to rely on each other. Hank, with his knowledge of the land, could sense the subtle changes in the soil, the faint whispers of moisture in the air. The townsfolk, with their ingenuity and resourcefulness, found ways to improve their digging techniques, to make the work more efficient. Even Sheriff Brody, who had initially been skeptical of the whole endeavor, found himself drawn into the effort. He helped to haul timbers, he shared his meals with the workers, and he used his authority to settle disputes and keep the peace. Maggie, her eyes shining with pride, continued to encourage them, to remind them of their shared goal. She saw the change in them, the growing sense of unity, the fading of the old resentments. She knew that they were on the verge of something extraordinary. Then, one morning, as the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, a shout rang out from the bottom of the well. "Water!" The word spread like wildfire through Dust Bowl Gulch. People came running from their homes, their faces filled with a mixture of disbelief and hope. They gathered around the well, peering down into the darkness, their hearts pounding with anticipation. Hank, his face etched with a rare smile, cranked the old drill one last time. And then a miracle. A gurgling sound, a rush of air, and then a stream of clear, sparkling water gushed forth, filling the air with the sweet, life-giving scent of hope. The well had struck water. The celebration was spontaneous and joyous. People laughed, they cried, they hugged each other. Even Hank, his face usually stoic, allowed himself a smile. The animals, sensing the change in the air, gathered around the well, their thirst finally about to be quenched. Maggie watched the scene with tears in her eyes. She had come to Dust Bowl Gulch hoping to teach children, but she had ended up teaching everyone a much more valuable lesson: the power of cooperation, the importance of hope, and the resilience of the human spirit. Sheriff Brody, his chest swelling with pride, stepped forward. "All right, folks," he said, his voice booming across the riverbed. "Let's not get carried away. We found water, but we still need to figure out how to share it fairly." He organized a system for distributing the water, ensuring that everyone got their fair share. He appointed Hank and a representative from the townsfolk to oversee the distribution, to make sure that there were no disputes. The water transformed Dust Bowl Gulch. Gardens sprang back to life, cattle grew fat and healthy, and the dust began to settle. The town was still scarred by the drought, but it was no longer dying. It was thriving, thanks to the well and thanks to the newfound spirit of cooperation. The well provided more than water, it provided hope. And the biggest change of all was in the relationship between Hank and the townsfolk. The old resentments were gone, replaced by a sense of mutual respect and understanding. They had faced adversity together, they had overcome their differences, and they had emerged stronger and more united than ever before. They had learned that they needed each other, that their survival depended on their ability to work together. The well was their legacy, a symbol of their resilience and their unity. Dust Bowl Gulch was alive again. Hank and Sheriff Brody, both covered head to toe in mud from working on the well, stood side by side, watching the celebration. The years of friendship, strained almost to the breaking point by the drought, seemed to melt back into place. They hadn't spoken much in the past weeks, but the unspoken understanding was there. They had faced the worst together, and they had come out on the other side, stronger and more united than ever before. Brody extended his hand to Hank. His hand was rough and calloused, but his grip was firm. "Thank you, Hank," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Hank hesitated for a moment, then took Brody's hand. Mud oozed between their fingers as they shook. "We did it together, Brody," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. "We all did." The handshake was more than just a gesture of friendship. It was a symbol of peace, a testament to the power of forgiveness and reconciliation. It was a muddy handshake, but it was worth more than all the gold in the world. From that day forward, Dust Bowl Gulch was a different place. The drought had left its scars, but it had also taught them valuable lessons. They had learned the importance of community, the power of cooperation, and the resilience of the human spirit. And they had learned that even the deepest divisions can be overcome with a little bit of hope, a little bit of hard work, and a whole lot of mud. Maggie stayed on, teaching the children, and now teaching the adults, too, about working together and helping each other. The town thrived, knowing they could rely on each other. The muddy handshake sealed the bond forever. And so, the story of Dust Bowl Gulch became a legend told and retold around campfires and in schoolhouses for generations to come. It was a story of hardship and resilience, of conflict and cooperation, and of the transformative power of hope. The well, forever known as Maggie's Well, stood as a monument to their shared triumph. It was carefully maintained, its water flowing freely to nourish the land and sustain the community. Hank and Sheriff Brody, their friendship rekindled, worked side by side to ensure the well's continued success. They became known as the Muddy Handshake Men, a symbol of unity and reconciliation. They taught their children and grandchildren the importance of working together, of respecting each other, and of never giving up hope even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. And Maggie, the young schoolteacher who had arrived in Dust Bowl Gulch with nothing but a dream, became a beloved figure, revered for her wisdom, her compassion, and her unwavering belief in the goodness of humanity. She continued to teach not just reading and writing, but also the values of community, cooperation, and hope. She showed them that even in the driest of lands, the seeds of hope can blossom into something beautiful, something life-giving, something that can transform a community and inspire generations to come. Dust Bowl Gulch learned to thrive together. The end.